Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Magical Learning Podcast. As you can see in the title, we've got a guest today. But before we get to them, we're going to be checking in with the regular team. Now, if you're a new listener or viewer of the Magical Learning Podcast, welcome. We are a podcast that is sort of an extension of Magical Learning, which has been a training and facilitation company for over 25 years, partnering with global thought leaders like John Mattone. We are really excited to get experts on and talk about areas that they are like sort of releasing books in, areas of expertise, and we've got a great one today. We'll get to them very shortly, but first, let's check in with the regular team. So, Danette, how are you going today? How's your week?
Yeah, it's been great, Jez. I've been at the farm most of the week. I had my first full-day workshop on Monday around change for the year, which was lovely, and then back to the farm. And this week had a unique visitor with four legs, thankfully. Gabrielle, we have a few brown snakes visited us, which we don't like so much. But we had a goanna, so we will share that video with our audience. We also have a tiny baby hare, which is very cute. So it was a lovely week. Thanks, Jez. How was your week?
My week's been good. I've just been doing a lot of podcast stuff, working on a different podcast that you're also on, Danette, the Adapt with Danette FM podcast, doing some stuff there. So you can go check that out if you want to remain adaptable. But other than that, not much. We just had... did some stuff around the house. I got a new desk, so potentially next episode I may have a new background. We'll see. I might have to change up my whole office. We'll see how that goes, but very exciting. Come tax time, that'll be a lovely deduction. Gabrielle, how are you? That's it. Gabrielle, how are you going this week?
Oh, I'm going great. Danette, when you were talking about the brown snakes, we've got a 25-acre property on the southern New South Wales coast, and we have a lot of red belly snakes. And we like the red bellies because they're territorial and they keep the brown snakes, which are can be quite aggressive away. So, last time I was up there, I saw two snakes in 15 minutes. It was like, what's going on? But my week's been good, except I've been diagnosed with plantar fasciitis. So I'm, doing lots of rolling a golf ball under my foot. And I actually play golf, and I'm not allowed to go on long walks. So we played golf yesterday, but we got a cart, which was, it's a lot of fun having a cart. I mean, I do like the exercise of walking, but it is a lot of fun. It's like hooning around the trees looking for your ball. So it's been a good week.
That's really incredible. And look, I'm going to make you feel even better about having plantar fasciitis because I believe, if I'm not mistaken, someone else that has that is LeBron James. So he's dealt with it in the past. So, it's just an athlete's injury that you're dealing with.
It's just all super athletes, just, I mean, I was talking to LeBron the other day and he was telling me about it. Yeah.
Well, Gabrielle, we're so excited to have you on. Other than hanging out with, obviously, NBA players, would you like to introduce yourself to our listeners so that they can learn a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, look, I'm considered an expert on storytelling, but going back about 25 years ago, I worked in corporate. So I worked at National Australia Bank, and my last probably 10 years in corporate was in L&D roles, in training roles, and in change management roles. And it was in those roles that I actually started to notice the power of storytelling. And I started to experiment with it myself. So when I sort of noticed that when I shared a story, people tend to get the message better. I looked at the great presenters that were sharing stories, the great trainers and teachers were sharing stories, the great leaders were sharing stories. And I remember thinking, I think this is a skill. I think it's a leadership skill, a communication skill, an influencing skill. And because I'd had experience in designing and delivering training programs in my L&D roles, I sort of thought, you know what, I think this is a skill, and I reckon I could be the person to teach people. And that was pretty much 21 years ago to the month, February 2005, I left my corporate career, and our kids were 2 and 5 at the time. And I sort of thought, you know what, if it doesn't work out, I'll just spend time with the kids and, go back and get another job. Well, it'd be fair to say 21 years later and just published my 9th book, it's worked out.
Well, that's exciting. And look, I think we've got so many great questions about storytelling. It's kind of everywhere. Do we want to just quickly touch on your new book? Because we're going to be talking about one specific part of it today, but the actual book is called Story Intelligence, the Craft of Authentic Storytelling Made Smarter with AI. So I guess, do we want to just talk a little bit about the book and then we can sort of deep dive into today's topic?
Yeah, and look, maybe I'll just talk about the premise of the book. So the last book I wrote on storytelling was 4 years ago, and I was convinced that was the final book I'd write on storytelling. Like, there's only so much you can write on a subject. But about 2 years ago, I'd run storytelling workshops, and I'd have people saying, "Will AI replace storytelling?" And I was actually horrified with that question. Like, why would you be even thinking that? And then I had more and more people say, "Can you use AI to help with your stories?" And my initial reaction was, "No, you can't. That's cheating, and you're going to lose the human element." And got on my bloody soapbox about it. But then I thought, well, if you're the expert in this, you should be open-minded. So I started experimenting with AI, with storytelling, and I was disturbingly surprised how good they were. Not pleasantly surprised at all, but disturbingly surprised. And so I started to do more and more work, and then I was speaking to my editor, and I go, "I think I need to write a book," which is going to sound a little bit paradoxical, because I truly believe that in a world of AI generated content, that our authentic stories are needed now more than ever. But AI is not the enemy, and used wisely being the key word here, AI can help find and refine your story. So the book is ultimately a storytelling book. It's still ultimately a storytelling book, but it is bringing in the concept, well, if you are going to use AI, here's how to use it properly.
Well, that's a very exciting jumping off point for today's conversation, because I think it really it begs many questions in the mind. So the topic we're actually doing today is how to be less at storytelling, which is a really exciting topic, because I think you've mentioned the exact crux of why it's so important right now. But I think Danette's questions usually tee up the conversation really nicely. So I might throw to Danette. Do you want to tell us a little bit about your questions, and then let's get into it and find out a bit more.
So, Gabrielle, I always have two questions because I've got a really curious mind. So, my
Go for it.
first one is just for our listeners and viewers who might be new to this topic. How do you personally define storytelling?
Yeah, it's interesting, Danette, that the title is Story Intelligence, and I was sort of drawn to that title when I sort of thought about it. I must admit, with the help of AI, but AI suggested narrative intelligence. I was like, "Ugh, I don't like the word narrative." But then I went, "Oh, but story intelligence," and I thought, "Oh, that's good." And it sort of reminded me of emotional intelligence as well. So I sort of liked that concept. And then part of it was like, working with my editor was like, "Well, what's the definition of that?" And there wasn't a dictionary definition, so I had to define it, and which is a lot harder than you think. But so if I can sort of, if I'll sort of, it's a bit lengthy, but to me, the definition of story intelligence, and I guess storytelling, using storytelling strategically, is the ability to purposefully and skillfully use authentic storytelling to communicate with clarity and to connect, engage, and inspire. Now, it's a bit of a mouthful, but the key things there is purposefully and skillfully. So to me, storytelling, especially in a work context, is why are you telling the story? You've got to be really clear on why you're sharing the story, and there is a skill to it. But then I think authentic storytelling is important, so it's got to be authentic. And look, the whole reason we are sharing stories in business is to actually help us communicate with clarity, so we get the message across, and to connect with our audience, to engage them, and dare say even inspire them. So that's my definition of story intelligence. And I should just say on that, my editor said you need to put AI into that definition, because the subtitle of your book is about AI. And I put it in, and then I took it out, then I put it in, then I took it out, and then I made the call to go, you know what? You could be brilliant at storytelling. You could have the highest story intelligence and never ever use AI. And, and we weren't doing it. We weren't using AI 2 years ago. So you don't have to use AI. And that's why I said before, the premise of the book, it is still a storytelling book, with some elements of AI in it.
I love that. And I love your definition. And, you know, sometimes clarity comes through a longer definition rather than a really short one. So actually, that was a really helpful definition. So
Thank you.
then what I'd really love is one or two examples that you have where people have shared their authentic story and it's had a really big impact. Because I guess this will show our listeners and viewers just how important working on their storytelling skills is.
Yeah. Look, let me share an example with you. And I love this example because I think it highlights beautifully what I mean by storytelling in business. Because a lot of people go, well, what does it mean? Is it like a case study or whatever? I go, no, a case study is a case study. It's not a story. Before I get into it too, I talk about the 4 different types of stories you can share. And one of them is a personal. So the 4 stories are personal, professional, parable, or public. The most powerful story you can share is a personal story. And what I mean by that is it just didn't happen at work. So it didn't happen at work, but how you connect it to a work message. So they're the most powerful, but they're the most underutilized. And there's a real skill in doing that. So let me give you an example. So I did some work with a risk team. So it was the entire risk team, and the head of risk, her name was Rosemary. And Rosemary, I was running a workshop with them, and she said, look, one of the biggest challenges I have is that when I talk about risk management to the teams I support, as soon as risk is raised, they all look at me and go, well, you're the risk manager. That's your job. And, some of your listeners may even have the similar thing. It was like, well, that's your HR, that's a people issue or stuff like that. Or your comms, that's your communication issue. And she said, I've tried everything to explain to them that I cannot manage their risk for them. All I can do is help them manage their risk. But she goes, the message doesn't get through. Like nothing is at work. She goes, I've tried case study after case study. I've given example after example of the benefits of managing your own risk. The consequences are not. Nothing has changed. I've tried everything. She tried everything except the personal story. Now, I'm going to share this story, and then actually I might ask you a couple of questions myself. So let me share the story she shared. When I was a kid, I grew up on a farm, and growing up on a farm, there was all these dangers we needed to be aware of, but Mum would teach us what to do. So we knew what to do when we came across redback spiders in the timber heap. We knew about all the potential traps in the dam after heavy rain, and we knew what to do if we ever came across a snake in summer. And I remember this day, I was running down to get my bike, and then I just froze because in front of my bike was this massive copperhead snake. But I remembered everything Mum taught us to do. So I played statues and I slowly walked backwards until there was enough space between me and the snake, and I ran back to the house to tell Mum. And I'm sharing this with you because it reminds me of the role we play in risk. All I can do is give you the skills, knowledge, and advice. So when you come across your own copperhead snake, regardless of what that looks like, you will know what to do. Now, I know we were talking about snakes earlier, but I'm gonna let me ask you 3 questions.
Story. Yep.
Does that story help you understand the role of a risk manager and the role you play in risk? Does it actually help you understand the message? Yeah, absolutely, right? So, communicating with clarity. So I understand. I now understand the message. Second question, do you think you'll remember that story?
Totally.
Yeah, you will. And I can talk a little bit later why you will remember that story, but you will remember that story. Yes. And finally, if you had to retell that story, could you retell it without losing its meaning? You wouldn't do it word for word, but could you retell it? Yeah.
Yes.
So I would say the fundamental challenges that we have when we're communicating, whether we're just speaking to our team or we're teaching, we're running training, or when we're communicating a message, do people really understand the message? Like really understand it? Can they remember it? So when the presentation's finished, when the training's ended, when the discussion's finished, can they actually remember it? And if they had to, could they go retell it to other people without losing its meaning? And a story will give you traction on those 3 things. Understand, remember, retell, where facts, figures, stats, I'm not saying you don't need them, and I'm not saying they're not important, but they're not sticky. People will remember the story.
Love that. And Gabrielle, you don't know this, but I used to be CFO at Safe Work Australia. So I love that it's actually on a safety thing as well, because you're totally right. People don't own that it's actually part of what they need to do. It's everyone's role.
Yeah,
so that's a great story.
Yeah, and I often, I do a lot of work with people in the safety industry, and it was like that. It's critical because you go, okay, these are safety messages. These are really, really important. So we share a story. And I often cite, if you've worked in an organization that has safety as a strong value, like, BHP or one of like the mine or anyone that has a strong safety value, they've been ahead of this for decades, because you would know that every meeting they have a safety share moment or a safety story, and they've got to share a story around safety. I did work with a large organisation and who had safety as a value, and they did that. And after I worked with them, they changed it up that every month they just changed the value. So, instead of doing safety stories all the time, they said, okay, this month we're going to do respect everyone or the stories. We're going to do customer service stories or whatever it was. So, yeah, it's like if you're doing any compliance or safety, stories are absolutely critical.
Yep. Oh, I love that. Great answers. Thank you. And I'll hand back to Jez.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's just reminded me, I've always, I don't know if you've ever seen the Final Destination movies. Have these ever crossed your path?
No.
Okay, but all I was going to say...
Me and Danetta, like, did they come out like, in the 2000s?
Yeah, they did come out in the 2000s.
Right, there you go.
They're a horror franchise, but essentially the premise is like someone has a premonition and it allows all these people to avoid death, so then death sort of hunts them out in unique ways. It's kind of the general premise, and so just a lot of coincidences happen and then someone will sort of pass away, but basically what the thing is that because of how these different sort of events happen, I've never seen anything that's better for OH&S because it's like you watch this and you go, all of it is just bad safety eventually takes these people out. So like even after watching that movie, I remember I went out to my backyard and there was all this loose wood and some of it had nails in it, and I literally turned all the nails facing down because I was like, after seeing this movie, it was too harrowing. So at least in that way, I've seen how storytelling can be almost too powerful for OH&S. Yeah.
Well, it's not too powerful. That's powerful, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. So anyway, that was what that reminded me of. But let's jump into some more questions because the team's written in some great ones here.
Mm-hmm.
And this one's from Graham, and he's written, in a world disconnected by TLDR and infected with AI, how much more important is a story's hook today?
I think. So first of all, let's talk about what we mean by the hook of the story. Humans are hardwired to both share stories. I mean, it's one of the things that separates us from other species is we actually share stories, right? And we're hardwired to listen to stories. And so I think the start of your story is critical. It's the hook, because what it does, it gets people's attention. And I would say even before AI, we are in a fast-paced environment. There's talk about the younger generation's attention span, but the reality is we're all busy. I think with COVID and a lot of us working from home and a lot of our presentations or training is virtual. We all know what we're doing when we're in a virtual training session, where you are, it's much harder to get people's attention, right? People are feeding the dog, they're cooking dinner while they're, doing. So it's critical to get people's attention because it hooks them in. My advice is the way you start a story will determine whether you get their attention or not. So it needs to be super succinct. And I always say start with time and place. So for example, the story I shared before about Rosemary's copperhead snake, the start of the story was, when I was a kid, I grew up on a farm. Now, I'm about to tell you a story. Like if I go, oh, that reminds me when I was in my 20s and I went on an African safari. It's like, bang, you've got people's attention. One of the worst ways to start a story, ironically, is let me tell you a story. Can you just feel, if people, please don't. Like, no, I'm not an idiot. Just tell me the point, because we conjure up all these bad experiences. So I see people all the time say, let me tell you a story about teamwork. I was like, don't say that. Just start. And so it's really important. And it's I think it's always been important, but I think it's super important in this information overload and stuff.
Yeah, it's also a fascinating space. Like I've just noticed just doing a bit of podcast production how much like people are trying to use hooks a bit more at the beginning of videos to try and hook people in. And it's fascinating. I noticed with podcasts, they'd start taking like a section out of the middle and put it right at the very front before even the sort of intro things to hook people in.
Yeah.
But I don't know if you've seen this with like TikToks now. There'll be a 2-minute TikTok and they'll take a 20-second clip from the middle of the TikTok as the hook at the start so that you watch the full 2 minutes. It's fascinating how that that is like how that's changed, and I guess exactly what you're saying. Like you have to hook people.
Yeah. We, I co-host a podcast as well, and we work with a producer, and you try to create those little snippets that go on, Instagram and TikTok. And what I know for a fact is if we've got a snippet of a story, God, you like you look at TikTok and it's like hundreds of thousands of views compared to, let's talk about the 5 tips, blah blah blah, and there's a couple of hundred views. So yeah, they're just so powerful.
Yeah, and that's another great sort of tip as technology is developing, how much it's refining that we just love stories. It's just fascinating. Wow. Well, let's continue on here. We got a lot of questions. So,
Okay.
all right, let's jump into Allegra's question here. So, Allegra's written in, what are some common mistakes people make when presenting that leads to the performance falling flat?
Yeah. Okay. Good question. There are a lot of common mistakes. And just on that word performance, I guess storytelling is a performance, but I don't want to think it is. Part of me says don't think of it as a performance, because a lot of people think, oh, I couldn't tell a story because I'm an introvert and I'm not like, this big performance person. When you tell a story, you don't retell it, you relive it, and you'd be amazed. I would see people who are probably dry presenters, like they're not great, and then they start to tell their story. It's like, oh my God, where did this person come from? And it was like, it's not a performance; it's actually because they're reliving it. So I don't want people to think it's got to be a big performance. It's storytelling's a day-to-day skill. But back to the common mistakes, and there are a few. And one I probably just talked about before. They start with "Let me tell you a story." Like, just do not do that, and definitely do not end your story with "the moral of the story is," right. So it's like there's a real skill, and this is the skill in trying to get people to understand the message without being directive, and saying the moral of the story is being directive. So, try to share a story without using the word story would be my advice. So, let me tell you a story, and the reason I'm telling you this story, and the moral, oh my God, stop saying the word story. The other big mistake is they go too long. So that is a big mistake. And my advice is your story should be about 60 to 90 seconds. 30. I've seen some brilliant stories being told in 30 seconds, right? But 60 seconds is your sort of sweet spot. If your story is going longer than 2 minutes, people are starting to think, get to the point. And the moment anyone starts thinking, get to the point, you're losing them. They're disengaging. And if you've ever had anyone say to you, get to the point, believe me, they've been thinking it for a hell of a lot longer before they've said it. So being super succinct not being succinct is a mistake. And I think the other really big mistake is people use made up stories, thinking, and I'm amazed I still have this conversation with leaders to this day. I'll be running a workshop and they go, but if the story's made up, but as long as it's believable and gets the point across, surely that's okay. Like, no harm done. And I always just say to them, so let's just say, for example, you were in the audience and Rosemary shared her copperhead snake story. So you were there and you reacted to the story the way you did. And then afterwards you went up to her and go, oh, God, I really loved your story about a snake. I grew up in the country too. Where did you grow up? And she went, oh, I grew up in the city. I made that up. So she's now told you the story's made up. Where's her credibility? Can you see that's more than a little white lie? That is more than a lie, because what it feels like is a betrayal of trust. What it feels like is manipulation. And if you're sharing stories and there's a whiff of manipulation, it's not going to work. You can influence, you can inspire, absolutely. But, there's a very big difference between influence and inspire and manipulation. And the reality is the only reason you've probably made up stories before is because you just think your stories aren't big enough or important enough. And they are.
Yeah, what a great insight. And I think that's it's so interesting how many of the mistakes are just informing people about where they're at in the story.
Yeah.
I think that's such a funny mistake because it's so counterintuitive, but I'm so glad you've told us because I
Yeah.
think it's helping everybody that's listening to this podcast forever.
Yeah,
Uh,
Jez, I have often when I go into an organization and I run workshops and they'll say something like, oh, the CEO or the head of wants to introduce you. And I went, great. And they'll go, and I saw this mistake happen because they're introducing me to do storytelling. They feel the need to tell a story. And so now I have to say to them, please tell them not to tell a story. And if they desperately want to tell a story, let's have a one-on-one conversation with them first, because they get up there and they'll go, let me tell you a story. And they go on for too long and they go, the moral of the story. And then I just come up straight after and say, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. And it makes them look foolish. So I always say, please either don't tell a story or let me have a chat to them beforehand if they're going to tell a story.
Yeah, no, I love that, and just to sort of add a finer point on that as well. I sometimes do stand up, and I've talked to some people that have like done it professionally, and what they are doing is like, and they're essentially professional storytellers. What they're doing is taking syllables out of words to make it shorter. They're all about getting it right down to the least amount of words, which is exactly what you're saying. It's that, how can I be as succinct as possible? You know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hey, Jez, that actually reminded me of, because I did stand-up comedy as well.
Great.
So, and I actually did a stand-up comedy course to, I always think if you can entertain and educate people at the same time, better. And I knew there was a structure to stories. And there's a structure to jokes. And a lot of the time, as you know, it's how you, well, clearly how you end the joke, but the words you end on. And the reason I'm talking about this is because of authenticity. So I say that when you're sharing a story in business, your stories need to be true. You need to believe in the message, and that you need to believe that, and the story actually has to have happened. So that's like two elements of authenticity. I remember when I was doing the stand-up comedy course, the coaches would talk about authenticity as in, is it believable? Like, would the audience believe this has happened? And so it doesn't have to be true. And, like comedians, half their stories aren't true, but it's believable. And then sort of right at the end, you go, that didn't happen. And so I would often have people say, but, comedians make up stories, but you still like them. And I go, yes. The transaction you enter into when you go see a comedian is, I'm going to pay you money and you're going to make me laugh. That's the transaction you enter into. The transaction you enter into business is, you will tell me the truth. There's an understanding there. And so that's the difference. So it's, in comedy, authenticity is believable, but in business, I think authenticity is true and congruent to your values.
Yeah. No, that's a great distinction. And I guess also at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter if a comedian lies to you, like it doesn't affect your life.
No.
But a business person, it actually could affect your life,
Yeah.
So, no,
and
that's great.
if you know how comedians start their jokes, it's normally, at the airport yesterday, can you see how they're starting with time and place? And so you automatically assume it's a true story, because they've started that way, and then it goes on, and then at the end you realize, clearly that wasn't true. Or it might have been true. Some of it's true. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, great. No, that's a great distinction, and what a fun little detour. All right, let's jump back into the questions now. This one's from Alan, and this is a bit more sort of, I guess, towards your book. And he's written, are there key steps to creating a good story, and has AI changed this process?
Okay. Yes, there are steps to creating a good story. So in my book, I take people through the entire process of that. And, it just in a, nutshell, you have to be clear on the message. So a lot of the time people go, I just can't think of a story. I go, okay, forget the story. Tell me what the message is. What are you trying to communicate? And they'll be still talking 15 minutes later. I was like, okay, so you're not clear on the message, right? So one single message. So I always start there. And then, so you're clear on this message. This is what I want to communicate. And then the next step is like, would a story help me do this? And you'd be surprised how many people don't even ask, would a story help me do it? So it's going, yes, it would. Then it's finding the right story. So let's just go without AI. So again, in this book, I talk about how you can do this without AI. And it's saying, well, where have you experienced this before? Where have you seen it? Where have you done it? And so you're trying to find a personal story or a work story as well. But again, the personal ones are better. And then once you've got that story, I then take people through the framework of how to start your story, time and place, what to put in the middle, what to leave out of the middle, naming your characters, stuff like that, the words you use, and then how to end it so it gets your message across without being directive. So that's the framework. What AI has done, and what I've experimented with doing AI to write the book, is you could use AI as your creative partner. So, Jess, if you said to me, I've got to give a presentation next week on the importance of, I don't know, innovation, right? I would take you through the process about, well, what does innovation mean to you? So you're clear on that. And then I would ask you all these questions like, has there been a time where you tried something different and it didn't work? Or has there been a time when someone suggested something to you and you didn't even give it a go? And I would ask you all these questions and you would think of a story. You would go, oh, yeah. There was a time, right? You can use AI for that. So you literally open ChatGPT or whatever you use and use the prompt. And again, in the book, I explain some of the prompts you could use, but it's literally saying, I need to give a presentation on innovation. This is what it means to me. I'm looking for a personal story. Can you act as my storytelling coach and ask me questions that will help me find my story? So it will just ask you all these questions and you will think of a story. The next thing ChatGPT would do, and I've got an example of this in the book, it'll go, just give me some bullet point details and I will put it into a story. And so you do that and it comes back with a story. And your initial reaction was, or my initial reaction was, well, that's pretty good. It's like, oh my God, that's really good. I've just made myself redundant. But then the trap is to go, oh, that sounds good. That sounds good. Then I go, but does it sound like you? And is it true? So, for example, a story could come back here. I did this and I felt really nervous about it, and you could go, I actually didn't feel nervous, but I actually felt really excited about it. So, okay, so put that in. I felt really excited about it. So you've got to make sure the stuff that AI is adding is actually true, that it happened. And if it didn't happen, it will probably prompt you to go, well, that didn't happen, but this happened. So that goes in the story. And then you've got to make sure it sounds like you. So I always say, speak it out loud. And if there's words in there that just do not sound like you, even though it may sound good, just don't do it. It's I had a perfect example of this just yesterday where I was completing a form, and the form asked me to put 2 paragraphs on me and why I would be appropriate for this. And I put something like, I help business people. I teach business people how to communicate more effectively through authentic stories. Right, that was my thing. And I used ChatGPT just to edit, I'm hopeless at spelling and grammar and stuff like that. And it came back with something, and it said, through storytelling, I bridge the gap between truth and impact. And it was like, what the hell is that? If those words ever come out of my mouth, shoot me now. It was like, but it part of me goes, it sort of sounds good. But I don't even know what it means. If someone said, what the hell does that mean? I go, I don't know. Got no idea. So first of all, it didn't sound like me. And so you just got to go, no, thank you, ChatGPT, but that's crap.
I love that it was about truth and impact, but
Yeah.
was not sure the impact or the truth was confusing.
Yeah. I bridge the gap between, and it's funny. The more I say it, you go, oh, actually, that could be my tagline. Gabrielle Dolan, she bridges the gap between truth and impact.
Danette, did you have something you want to say?
No. That's a great example of it giving you stuff, but as you said, it's not your authentic voice. So I love that.
It's not my authentic voice. And I think the more people use ChatGPT for not only stories but for content, it is efficient. So it can be efficient. I always say to people, when it comes to communication and connection, are you trying to be efficient or are you trying to be effective? So I think just don't be lazy. Don't be lazy with it. Use it as your creative partner, but never ever lose your voice in the process.
Love that. Well, let's jump into Kanika's question here. Speaking of voices and everything, storytelling might be one of our most ancient and most human art forms. What makes it so important to us as a species? I feel like you've touched on this a little bit, but we can sort of just look at this again.
Yeah, no, and we're going to do different. It is our most ancient. I mean, we're here in Australia, and you have to look no further than our First Nations people, the oldest culture in the world, and their Dreamtime stories have come down from tens of thousands of generations based on stories. Like, there's no bloody Excel spreadsheets or knowledge databases there to capture information, right? So it's tens of thousands of years. The message has not been lost because of the story. Now, remember, I shared the copperhead snake story and I said, would you remember it? Do you get the message? Would you remember it? Would you retell it? That's the power of the story. And our First Nations people have proven that can happen over tens of thousands of years, not just a week in business. So that's always been there. I remember when I shared the copperhead snake story and I said you'll remember it. The reason you'll remember it and the reason why stories are so powerful is because the human brain, what that story has done. So first of all, it's helped you visualize something. If I asked you to tell me what you saw when I was telling that snake story, and I asked Annette, you would both describe something completely different, but you've both visualized it, and everyone would visualize the story. So the story helps us visualize something. The other thing that story has done, it's tapped into emotion. Now, when I say emotion, I'm not talking about emotional, like you got to be really scared of snakes or something. I mean, clearly me and Danette are not scared of snakes because we're surrounded by them. But it's tapped into emotion without you knowing it or without you having any control over it. It's tapped into emotion. As human beings, we make decisions on emotion. So that's what we do. We classic salespeople will tell you people buy an emotion and they justify with logic. And whether you're buying a new pair of shoes or the latest iPhone or buying a house or buying into an idea or buying into a strategy or buying into working for you or buying into a change, that is an emotional decision. So logically, it should all make sense. Like let's not get rid of the logic. It should logically make sense, but logic is just going to inform people. It's not going to influence them because the story taps into emotion, and that is what we will remember. And with emotion, it stores it in the long-term part of our brain as well. So the reason you'll remember the story is because it's been stored in the long-term part of the brain. So I always say to people, I'm not saying get rid of facts. I'm not saying, just go with story, and you don't need facts, you don't need data. Like, it's not about that, but stories will make your message sticky. I remember a few years ago, I was in New York with my daughter Jess, and we went to the 9/11 Memorial Museum and we did a tour. And like a tour, any tour, there was lots of information, stats, figures, and there were stories. And we were walking out of the tour, like this was 10 minutes later. And Jess said to me, Mum, how tall did the guy say that column was? And it was like, I don't know. I couldn't remember. I could not remember one fact 10 minutes later. I'm not saying I wasn't interested. The facts were very interesting at the time, hearing them, but I couldn't remember them. The stories I heard, I will remember for the rest of my life, the stories I heard. So stories make your message sticky. It helps you understand, and it's what people will understand and remember.
Yeah, great. And I think that's such a good way to explain why sometimes I can't remember people's names, but I can remember something that happened to them, Like, it's like that fact is just blown past me, but I can remember details about their life that I know, now.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's and it's like if sometimes people go, I remember this. Yeah, I remember this guy or this woman presentation, and I remember the story they shared. And I go, like, how long ago was that? And they go, that was like 10 years ago. And I go, what else can you remember from that presentation? They go, nothing, just the story. So it's just, I did my MBA 30 years ago, and I would say that the only thing I remember is a story a lecturer shared. It's just like
that's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
Well, I might just quickly jump into this last question here because I think it really touches on what we were talking about at the very end there with that last piece, which is I think amazing stories allow us to feel a lot of different emotions through them. Like whenever I think of like movies that win Best Picture or stuff like that, typically what I think is happening is a lot of emotions are kind of being triggered throughout that movie or whatever. How does that interact with AI, which has a different experience of emotion than we do?
Yeah. So look, a couple of things too. Story, like I just said before, story taps into emotion. If you share a story, it taps into emotion. Now, as the storyteller, you don't need to decide what emotion you want to tap in. You don't need to go, I want them to be really scared of this, or it just by default, it will tap into emotion. So I don't think you need to think about what emotion you want people to share. I remember I read an article once, and this someone said there's 4 types of stories you need to share as a leader, and one of the stories was a tearjerker. And I'm thinking, wow, if your premise of telling a story is to get people crying, that is pure manipulation. Like, just, say always start with the message, and it will by default tap into emotion. AI, if you're helping AI, if you're using AI generated stories, the one thing they will lack is human connection and emotion. And believe this so much that as part of researching the book, I put this in the book, I put my storytelling ability up against ChatGPT and Claude. So I chose 6 different subjects. I wrote a personal story on each one. I got Claude and ChatGPT to write a personal story, and then I got people to rate them. Now, the people had no idea whose stories was who, and they actually had no idea that 12 of them were AI generated. And what the thing came back where the AI stories were rated high in clarity, as in it made sense. It made sense. They were rated really low in believability and authenticity, it's connection. So it's sometimes when you read an AI story, you just go, yeah, I don't think it sounded like that. Like one of the stories, for example, was about having it go, like having the courage to do something. And the AI generated story was, I was in a meeting and I'm really scared of public speaking, but the manager was looking for someone to present. And, I was sitting there, and as a person that hates public speaking, you secretly hope you get picked. And I'm going, no, as a person that hates public speaking, no one's sitting there, I secretly hope I get picked. And you're just going, oh, that's like just bullshit. Didn't happen. Doesn't happen. So there's always elements that just don't feel right. And you might not be able to pinpoint it like that, but there's just something you always go, it's just, I don't know, something doesn't feel real. Hello, that's because it's not.
And you know what? I think that ties a really nice bow about the whole conversation, because you were starting talking about how people shouldn't make up stories for business things, and then you're talking about how even when AI tries to create fake stories, there is just this level of inauthenticity that's always going to be present in all these things.
Yeah.
So I think that's like humans must have a pretty good bullshit detector or
They
something.
do.
Yeah.
And look, Australians, I've worked all around the globe. Australians and New Zealanders have the highest bullshit detectors in the world. So, just don't go there.
Well, thank you so much for the chat today. I'm going to grab some final thoughts before we wrap up, and I'll start with Danette. Danette, did you have any final thoughts on today's conversation?
Yeah, so Gabrielle, thank you so much. Masterclass in storytelling. And I love how you've brought how AI can support us, but it's not going to replace it. And so many great tips and stuff. I do data storytelling as one of the things because I have a finance background. And I always say data informs, stories change behavior. And what you were saying absolutely proves that. And I really loved the Copperhead bike story. That's really stuck with me.
Yeah, absolutely. I have a similar thing where I go facts tell, stories sell. So it's just
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you.
Yeah, no, and thanks for that, Danette. Great questions today, and it was lovely. I have to say, my biggest takeaways were obviously other than the stories, and I'm excited to see how long I hold on to this Copperhead story for, because now, probably forever. But I loved that you put story intelligence as just the words purpose and skillful together as like 2 massive elements of it. I was like, this is a good way to look at it. And then the other thing that I thought was good was how you sectioned out stories into professional, personal, parable, and
public.
There you go.
Yeah.
But I thought that was good because I'd never thought of them as different things. I just thought of storytelling as a broad skill, but there are different contexts and they each have their own sort of things. Did you want to leave our listeners and viewers with anything before we wrap up today?
Let me if I may, I might read something because it's all about AI and authenticity. In the book, if you've ever read Elizabeth Gilbert's Big Magic book, she writes a letter to fear about like fear can come along for the ride, but it can't be in the driver's seat. So I was inspired by that, and so I wrote a letter to AI. So do you want me to read it? No, I need my glasses for this.
Yes, please do.
All right, dearest AI, creativity and I are about to go on a road trip together. I invite you to join us. I will be doing my job on this road trip, which is to work hard and stay focused. And creativity will be doing its job, which is to remain stimulating and inspiring. There is plenty of room in this vehicle for all of us. So make yourself at home, but understand this. Creativity and I are the only ones who will be making any decisions along the way. I recognize and respect the supporting and valuable role you can play, so I will at times ask you for advice and suggestions along the way. But understand that I will always make the final decision and I will always be in control. Don't take this personally, as I know you won't, because you are not a person. But I know sometimes while you are eager, you hallucinate. So sometimes you are wrong. You also come with some built-in biases, so we are not always aligned. So you're allowed to have a seat. You're allowed to have a voice when asked. But my dear friend AI, you are absolutely forbidden to drive. I will always be in control. And maybe I'll just leave it on that.
I think that we somehow need to get, I feel like every person to sign something like that, because that sounds like a great philosophy we can all go forward with there. Just, like
Yeah.
using it as a part of the system, but not allowing it to make the decisions, and keeping the responsibility and the creativity with yourself, and then
Yep.
using it as a tool. I think that's something that I feel like I need to write my own version of this so that I can fully
Good.
get locked in. But no, I've loved that. Now, Gabrielle, I'm sure people have been listening to this and thinking, where can I not only find the book, but reach out to you if they want to reach out to you as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've got a website, GabrielleDolan.com, but I'm very active on LinkedIn. So connect with me on LinkedIn. I run my own podcast, as I said earlier. So Keeping It Real with Jack and Ral. I'm the Ral of that duo. So if you listen to podcasts, which you clearly do because you're listening to this, then check that out. But yeah, Story Intelligence, it's available online, Amazon, Booktopia, all the usuals, and in most bookstores. So, in Australia, it's in Dymocks and the airports, but yeah, it's available globally online.
Excellent. And look, we highly recommend go checking out that podcast straight after this, because I had a little listen and it's very fun. It's a great podcast. So no, thank you so much for being on. Thank you so much for being on today's Magical Learning Podcast, Gabrielle. It's been an absolutely excellent conversation. Danette, thank you so much as well. Great questions and great insights. Thank you to everybody that's been sharing and listening and viewing. We've been really appreciating it. And as always, everybody, stay magical.